I wanted to say, I took a few notes during Ken's salubrious presentation the other night. And I was trying to figure out a way to characterize, not so much for you, but for myself, what he represents in the annals of architecture discourse. And it reminded me of a strange thing that happened, and we often discuss the book Hitchcock and Johnson produced in 1929. This is how to be a modernist architect. This window system, this brise-soleil system, this column system, this color system, this structural system, all of that. Again, if you look at the appendix of that book, it's like a rule system for being a modern architect. But what it left out, and this is a criticism often leveled at Philip Johnson, what it left out is the antecedent social and political context out of which modern architecture, to which modern architecture originally belonged. Could be futurist, could be constructivist, could be die Style guys, and so on and so on. And I think when you hear from Ken, what you get is, as I said the other night, it's not so much the words, it's the conviction. So if he's a modernist, he's a European modernist in the sense that there's a social and a political ideal, an ethic or ethics that belongs to his point of view, so that what he does or what he opposes is related to what I think we rarely hear about anywhere in the discourse of architecture, which is a kind of ethical position. And that's what it's sitting on. Now, whether he can make the case for that or not, we'll see. But I think to understand his premise in that way is an essential part of what he is and who he is. And I don't think we see or hear a lot of that. Let me put up one image. You can see it.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you may recognize that. So this is an easy one. And Ken said the other night, he was talking about a couple of projects in China that we know, and made a reference to the use of steel in terms of waste. So remember that comment? All this wasted steel. So this is the Seagram building that Ken knows and I presume loves. And as some of you know, attached to the face of that building is a 3-inch by 5-inch custom aluminum I-section. And I guess the question has really to do with the definition of what constitutes waste, or what would be the opposite of waste in terms of a conceptual efficiency in architecture. And given the role of the Seagram building as a paradigm in this discussion, whether that aluminum I-section also constitutes waste.
Right. Question.
Yeah.
I actually, coming here, talking to you this morning and being here a very short time, and this morning I woke up and I started to think about this discussion, and I started to think that it would be interesting to I might try and do it actually, probably unwise, is to put together a kind of alphabetical collection of aphorisms. Because I think sometimes aphorisms are extremely, they're extremely stimulating, and they're kind of, they come back if they're good, I mean. And one of them is Thomas Maldonado, who is now, must be my age, a bit older, I think, living still in Milan, I think. That I first encountered in Princeton in the 68, 9. And an amazing aphorism, which I don't know whether he took it from somebody else or not, but it's a great aphorism, I think. While you cannot make anything without waste, this is distinguishable from an ideology of waste. And I think it's a beautiful aphorism, you know, because it has also political connotations, you know. And
say it again. Can you say it again?
While you cannot make anything without waste, this is distinguishable from an ideology of waste. I think it's really a deep aphorism. And okay, it doesn't really answer your. It's a kind of stepping to one side of the question, I admit. You know, I think that well, there's always a certain ornamental aspect to architecture. I mean, I think that those mullions, which are not absolutely essential, of course, to make the building, are fundamental to giving the shaft its verticality, to establishing the verticality of the shaft, you know. And so it modulates what is the raw product form, use another term, and puts on these, yes, they have an ornamental aspect in order to perceptually make the shaft, you know. And I think, you know, you can see also in the earlier period, I mean, the question of high-rise building was always this problem of how to establish the shaft. I mean, if you think of Sullivan's Buffalo building, you know, Guarantee, you know, the repression of the spandrels is obviously done to emphasize the shaft, you know, to make it a vertical thing. And it's the same, basically. It's much simpler.
But I think what I would say to that is that's a poet's exegesis. It doesn't really, I mean, because if you follow that logic, you could say, if it's beautiful, so I'm translating your aphorism, if it's beautiful, ipso facto, it's not wasteful. In which case, you could make the argument, if you chose to do so, that if CCTV is beautiful, ipso facto, it's not wasteful. And the question is, are we getting around to a point which really makes this a matter of taste? Or is there an operational principle that you could apply that validates the I section in the Seagram building, but won't validate in a different context in Beijing?
Well, you know, it is of course predicated on the idea that, I mean, I actually, you know, there's studies in tectonic culture. One of the reasons why I got involved in that is because, you know, this question of the relativity of everything and what is autonomous to architecture qua architecture. And I think the autonomous aspect is that it is built, you know, unlike all sorts of other artworks. It's fundamentally a building, it's a built work, you know, and the construction structure is essential to its autonomy, its relative autonomy. And the Guarantee building is interesting again because, you know, on the ground floor, it's a very beautiful treatment of the lower two floors with these plate glass windows cut back and these fat columns, that everything's covered in terracotta anyway. But the columns are on the spacing of the structural steel frame, you know, that has a certain kind of economic dimension. And then when it goes above, though, for the shaft, every other pier is a false pier. One pier is in front of a piece of structural steel, and the other one is empty. It's false. But the establishes that double rhythm, again, to create the verticality of the thing. So it is poetic, of course. I mean, how can one contemplate the question of architecture, you know, without admitting to a poetic aspect? Otherwise, it becomes entirely reductive. I was thinking this morning also about Bucky Fuller's thing, you know, this term Dymaxion, maximum advantage gain for minimum energy input, you know, which could be seen as, you know, the ultimate ethical, moral thing. But of course, it's deeply reductive.
It is, and you could argue the opposite, actually, that there's an enormous appeal in something which is not under the bottom, but over the top. You know, there's something in human affairs which is communicated by the opposite in terms of energy and content and emotive force that would be the opposite of a reductive, minimal, and that also has an appeal.
Yes. I mean, I quoted this this morning in an interview at some point, this in the reviews. This famous aphorism of Adolf Loos, which is all art is erotic. That's how it opens up. Ornament and Crime opens up with these. So in that sense, art is kind of desire, surplus. But it touches on the problem, of course, of what is the boundary between art and architecture. That preoccupies me. I'm disturbed by buildings that end up in being large art, I am, to be honest, I can't cut it differently. And what I don't like about the CCTV is that it's, in a certain sense, inept, It's determined to do this thing, this dramatic thing. But, with a great deal of contempt for that aspect of architecture which is associated with heroic engineering form, which I think is something that you can only dispense with, why would you have such contempt for heroic engineering form? Because I know damn
heroic, hang on a second, heroic and engineering aren't synonymous.
No.
So it would be conceivable to associate whether that's heroic or not, or it's the wrong era, but in conception that you could make something which is absolutely heroic, but has very little to do with the principles of engineering in a literal sense.
Yeah, but it's just heroic form. It's not engineering form.
Well, it might be heroic. It might be heroic in terms of here comes Constantine. There are a lot of issues of heroism that have to do with social or political or historic issues which wouldn't necessarily rise or fall on a capacity to express an engineering technique.
Of course not. You can't, architecture can't be reduced simply to that. I agree. But I know perfectly well that that building is inspired by Liszewski's Wolkenbügel, 1924. And depends on, if you look at the Wolkenbügel, it's also somewhat weird work, but the engineering is sort of coherent. It makes sense as a heroic engineering, as a cantilever, et cetera, and this building doesn't make sense. It's just, pack it with steel, make it stand up. It's the same as Richard Meyer. I couldn't care less, what you make the building stand up. Just make it stand up. I'm not interested in how it stands up. I think that's somehow reductive.
But aren't
I think architecture edges into reduction when it has no interest on that fundamental issue.
But I think you could, one response to that would be that the possibility exists that you're conflating a means with an end, and you're making a means into an end, and in that sense, the real meaning of meaning is getting lost in that you're looking at the tool that holds it up and the expression of the tool. So if it's a cantilever or whatever it is that makes the support of the building intelligible in a conventional engineering sense, and you're giving that a value as an end in itself, as opposed, for instance, to why would you do it, or for what does it stand?
You see, I think it brings back the ethical question, though, because, you could have the feeling that the way in which we use resources in general is absolutely insane, I mean ethical and not moralistic. I think that those two buildings, and we haven't talked about the other building, but the stadium and the CCTV, suffer from the fact that the ethical fault, so to speak, it diminishes the poetic potential of the work. That's what I believe. I think that in putting something together as complex as architecture, you don't have to be reductive about any particular factor. In fact, on the contrary, you should be able to modulate the synthesis so it has more than one level of meaning. The trouble with the CCTV is this form, get it or don't get it. That's it. It has no space inside it of any interest. Its use of structure is barbaric. I mean, it's just an absurdity. You know, it has no interest. There's nothing. You know, it's a one-off thing. You either love the thing like that, goodbye, thanks very much. You can do nothing with the building. It's a zero. If you look at the section of that building, it's absolute reductive beyond belief.
Well, I think that's, this is not a defense of the building per se. The building has no section.
Yeah, it has a section, but it's a bore.
It has, well, that's right.
It doesn't have any, there's nothing poetic in that section. Just stuff the people in, all 10,000 of them.
So how poetic is this section? How poetic is the section through the Seagram?
No, the section isn't too interesting, I agree with you, but at least, you know, it's a public building. It creates a civic space. It has this kind of civic dimension. There's no civic space in the CCTV. Not outside, not inside. So he's not interested in that issue. He's not interested. He's just interested in you know.
But I think we're getting a little bit. I'm not defending
I know,
one
but
of the buildings per se. But what I'm trying to do is obligate you to account for a kind of operational principle that you're outlining in terms of efficiency equals ethics, and efficiency and ethics correlate with a particular usage of technique and technology, so that those three components fit together. And the question is that so?
Well, you know, it's a circular thing. It comes back to this question about the degree of waste, you know. Well, steel, what's the point of using steel in this kind of cavalier? What's the point? Just because the Chinese will pay for it? It's crazy, you know. Why do it? What is the point? It's just, you know, I want to be an artist.
Well, but then,
you know,
okay.
You know.
But then if you want to conclude that the beauty component or the art component validates the use or misuse of the steel, rather than saying the efficiency component validates the use or misuse of the steel. I mean, they're two very different things.
I mean, I suppose it's my argument is a partly appeal to elegance in the sense of, you know, an elegant solution to a mathematical problem. You know, that idea of elegance.
But is it a Euclidean mathematics or is it a fractal mathematics? I mean, the different kinds of mathematics which account for very different forms and shapes.
I mean, I'm using it as a metaphor anyway, you know.
Yeah.
This question of an elegant solution to a problem. I mean, I just think that it's interesting. I was saying this morning, you know, that, and I do think it's a kind of, unfortunate omission, and also probably, you know, also you could say it all goes together. But the concept form, the word form for that matter, and the word beauty don't appear in my writing hardly ever, right? And
there's still time.
Yeah, I hope so. Right. But, you know, and I'm aware of it. Yes, I'm aware that this is like a missing thing.
Because you're using the term elegant, you know? Is that a synonym? That's a qualitative term, so it has something to do with appearance as part of the criteria.
Yeah, no, it is, yes. But, you know, it also has to do with you know, the essence behind the appearance, you know. I mean, it's not an argument.
But what is that, the essence behind the appearance?
It's the gap. It's a very important gap between the appearance and the substance. I think that in this gap between appearance and substance in architecture, there's a lot of dimension for a poetic expression. The elision between appearance and substance, between, you know, this is...
Okay, so we're talking about how much is enough and how much is too much, which is the only reason I raised the Seagram building.
I know.
Because that qualitatively has some of what you, at least as an argument, would appear to be in opposition to.
You see, one of it's unfortunate coinage of terms, but in the studies in tectonic culture, I try to discriminate between what I call ontological tectonic and representational tectonic. You know.
Yep.
And you know, if you take a Doric column, I mean, it's a corny classic example, but it's you know, separate cylinders of stone plopped on top of each other with a central bronze spigot to centralize the element. And at a conceptual conceptual, poetic point of view, the column doesn't really exist until the flutes are cut on the column. And these flutes are the representational tectonic. They represent the column. I mean, you can say that, well, it's a fact that it's a kind of translation into stone of an earlier, what was wood, of course. I mean, we now know it was wood, archaeologically. And it's an effort, of course, to make a monument permanent, you know. And that involves this representational element, which is the flutes. And you could say that the mullions projecting out of the Seagram building are they are partly representational. They also function, I mean, perceptually to make the shaft. You know. But in the same way as the flutes on the Doric column function to make the column.
Well, look,
You know,
you could make an argument, and the argument's been made by others, that the I section is the wrong material anyway, because you can't build anything at that scale out of aluminum; it'll fall down.
In that case, it didn't, did it?
No. and although when he did it in Chicago, he did it out of steel, and he did it out of 5x8, and you can buy it in the store. This you can't buy. You have to make this.
Expensive, but
right?
Yes.
Right. But I think the point has been made that this is an analog or a symbol for a time and a culture and a kind of this means to us a level of technical prowess, maybe.
Yeah.
And guess what represents that? It's the I section. So you could, whether he said that or he did that or that interpretation is legitimate, but it's been said. So what this is a connotation of meaning that belongs to a time and a technical capacity, which is different than what preceded it.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So, I mean, whether let me ask you something else. You're talking about, I think we talked about it a little bit this morning, this critical regionalism.
Yeah.
And the Charlie Jenks use of the term as well, although he seems to mean something quite different.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when you think about work that comes out of a region, isn't the idea of critical regionalism a non sequitur? Isn't it a contradiction in terms? Because the regionalism that we understand as, probably in your terms, indigenous or organic, that grows ontologically, your terms, out of very particular circumstances in very different places in the world, and ergo very different solutions. And then, wait a minute, when it gets critical, it gets not so much intuitive or instinctive, but it gets cerebral. It gets self-conscious. That's why somebody raised their hand and said, wait a minute, how come the work you're showing belongs to guys who are living in London and not in Guinea or something?
Right.
And so the question is raising or utilizing the label critical regionalism confusing what really is the meaning of regionalism, which is uncritical, instinctive.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's indisputable. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's also this very beautiful passage in Adolf Loos's essay, Architecture 1910, in which he has this Socratic argument with the peasant who's building his house, right? And then he asks the peasant, is it a beautiful roof or an ugly roof? And the peasant says, he doesn't know. It's the roof, like the roof his father built and his grandfather built,
right,
etc., etc. You know, that is vernacular without a doubt, and I think you can say, and is, you know, as you rightly pointed out, has been shaped by region, you know, over a long period of time, and is, you can say, unself-conscious. That's why he doesn't know whether it means nothing to him, the categories beautiful and ugly. You know, the term aesthetics gets invented in the middle, in 1850. Before that, the term doesn't exist, you know.
But it's operationally intelligible, it keeps the rain out.
Yeah, sure, of course it is. All those things it does. But it also has a kind of, you can say, and you were alluding to it in a way, a kind of inherent, also unself-conscious poetic, in the same way as a way of making wine or or cooking food, or cultivating, all these kind of pre-industrial techniques, you know, were of the place, of the climate, of the people, etc., etc. And that has an authenticity which we don't have access to. You know, and hence this crazy term, critical regionalism, is, of course, meant to demonstrate a kind of self-consciousness that you can't. The vernacular is not accessible to anybody.
I think what I'm saying is that when you make regionalism critical, you undo the regionalism. You take its premise away.
Well,
so then you're talking about it as a kind of, but then you've made it a kind of style. You've made it a kind of choice, whereas the original argument is that it doesn't come out of surveying the possible choices and picking one. It comes from techniques that grow up indigenously. It's different.
Indisputably, yes.
Yeah.
But still, in making that, you know, if you are, I mean, it's a question of to what level do you want to push it. But I mean, if you are conscious of certain qualities of certain climates and the consequences of these climates, and now we know, of course, even climate is changing, but of the specificity of the site, its topography, etc., etc. You know, it's possible to predicate the work, at least in part, on on a response to those conditions.
But wait a minute. The response to those conditions that belongs to an indigenous culture belongs to a particular period of time, so that when there were no choices, or whatever the choices are, have evolved over a longer period, and certain conclusions have been reached. And now what's available are very different opportunities. I mean, as Mies once said, turn up the air conditioning. So that there are options that belong to the region is different, the culture is different. And what you seem to be saying is that it's harder to do. I'm not sure you're saying you can't do it. It's harder to find a genuine manifestation of a broader culture, and easier to find a genuine manifestation of what is local and historic. But the problem is we're not local anymore or historic anymore. And if Renzo Piano makes a building which is an enormous analog with a primitive hut, and that's a sign of virtue because it's analogous to something that has an utterly different meaning, so that the analog is false, because you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues involved at once, but you know, it's interesting. The term critical regionalism is alexonis, with respect to those Greek architects I showed at the beginning of the lecture, in particular regard to Picionis and to Constantinides. And why qualify by critical? Because he, being very political and very aware of the fact that the Heimatstile of the Third Reich, etc., you know, was a force of manipulative political reaction. You know, this idea that you could go back to Heimat, you know, which reminds one, you know, of homeland security, etc., which is not completely uncontaminated by the idea of Heimat here now in this United States. And you know, it's in reacting to the trauma of modernization, and I think that's what, you know, yes, it's what we experience directly, are experiencing directly. You know, what kinds of, you know, architect, what kind of position can you take in relation to the trauma of modernization, or for that matter, societies? That's why Ricoeur says in this discourse, Universal Civilization and National Cultures, not every culture can withstand the impact of universal civilization, i.e. it gets wiped out by universal technology, because, so that's why the idea of resistance, however pathetic, is introduced by me, you know, that it's possible to through a hybrid operation to both participate in certain aspects of universal technology, but not entirely empty out all possible reference to other things which are of a more older, more earthbound character, you know.
But what you're wrestling with, I think, is certainly a valid problem and issue, as long as we continue to recognize that being in China is different than being in America. And by the way, being in Beijing is different than being in Guangzhou, the different languages, different histories, and so on and so on. In other words, the question would be, is there a valid way of delivering what is a legitimate cultural context for a particular place or country in a time frame when the capacity to do what we can do and build what we can build is utterly different from what it was when Sun Tzu was writing and Lao Tzu was writing. So, because the paradox of China, I think we talk about this a lot, the paradox of China is they kicked out the West, they kicked out the British, they kicked out the French, they kicked out the Dutch, they kicked out the Americans, and then they started to build all of the things that the Americans and the British and the Dutch were advocating but couldn't quite implement. You could argue that Shanghai is an extreme manifestation or a conclusion, I don't know if it's a conclusion, there may be more chapters, of what the West has been doing or advocating, in a sense, in a more genuine way, because it seems to come more out of the meaning of the West than it does out of the East. So the question is, somebody about a year ago called me from Abu Dhabi. This is an anecdote, but it's an odd one, and said, Moss, can you please come to Abu Dhabi and talk to the Planning Commission, Abu Dhabi, and tell us how we can integrate the local culture, the Bedouin culture or whatever it is, in the making of a contemporary city. Answer is a little bit late for that, interrogatory. So there is a subject, I think, a completely valid subject about what differentiates cultures or pieces of cultures and how to realize that in an architectural way, as opposed to assuming that what belongs to Singapore belongs to Vienna. The question is whether your answer to that, which seems in a certain sense to be a throwback to something like the hut used to look this way, now we've put it in a Xerox machine and enlarged it 10 times. And qualitatively, that gives both an aspect of new technology and communicates a history of a place. But of course, the history never had any meaning at that scale made with those tools. So it turns into an image in a way, like, can't we remember what we used to be? And it seems that I don't think ultimately that works as a solution. So I think you're onto a problem, but whether what you're calling critical regionalism gives you ground for a solution, and even the solutions you like and you advocated in the talk are isolated points in the forest, near a jungle, that kind of thing, where an individual architect with some talent could make something that appears in many ways to be a non sequitur relative to the current capacity of the culture. So I don't know that we know the answer, and I think the topic is an absolutely valid topic. We came up in the Mexico National Library thing. In other words, what belongs to Chichen Itza or Uxmal or Teotihuacan, and also to a contemporary? How do you do that? I don't think anybody's really answered that. I think there are a lot of people who have ignored it, and you're one who has tried to make it an issue. I guess what I'm saying in the end is whether critical regionalism has some of the qualities of this, that it's a sign of something. Like, don't you get it, guys? We used to be like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I backed off from the term and did this thing, studies in tectonic culture, is because, one of the issues that I tried to play with in the first version of critical regionalism is this opposition between tectonic and scenographic, recognizing that, you can't, as it were, exclude the representational aspect of making a building, i.e., that you can't sort of say, this is, you can't have the aim that this just be an exclusively tectonic building or with no scenographic element. I mean, or let's say more generally, no representational elements. In fact, you could say the tectonic, it's in one way or another, either at a small scale or larger scale, must involve some kind of representation. But, so maybe the term, I mean, I'm stuck with the term, but then of course last night actually it comes out of an essay, and I realized that the essay I wrote in Domus, the first of the new Domus, about agonistic architecture, which is also equally unfortunate term, I think, touches on the same issue. It brings up, I go back to the same point. Whether I should, stop going to that point, that's an interesting, maybe I should.
I'm not saying that at all.
No, well, maybe one should recast it differently in order to arrive at a more open discourse about the problematic of building, in this moment of history. And when you were talking about Mies and, turn up the air conditioning, I found recently this statement by Mies, actually in the Museum of Modern Art in a casual exhibition. And I asked Barry Bergdorf, I see there's no date or anything underneath this quote. And he said, no, I don't know where it comes from. And so far, I don't know where it comes from. But this is Mies in the 1950s. There are no cities, in fact, anymore. It goes on like a forest. That is the reason why we cannot have old cities anymore. That is gone forever, planned city and so on. We should think about the means we have for living in the jungle and maybe do well by that. That's a kind of, it's a funny statement, but it's, you realize that he, this is not long after he came to the States, of course, he recognizes what's happening, and yet we still have departments of urban planning and urban design, and God knows we go on talking about it forever, but in fact the capacity of the society to build cities is gone completely, It's all megalopolis, the whole bloody thing is megalopolis, one freestanding building after another, that's the
But what are the capacity of society to build a city, and what would be a manifestation of that historically that we can't do anymore?
Medieval period, was the very invention of cities is the medieval invention, and you could say that in the 19th century it was still possible to project and realize cities. I mean, Haussmann, for example, etc. Or yes, realize concentrated. Coherently ordered cities under authoritarian power. It's clear that Paris was created like that. So was Vienna. The Ringstrasse, etc. And once that's out, once we have democracy, etc., and pluralism and so on, and various forces, obviously competing for the prize. No longer possible to do it. There's not the power left to do a coherent.
Well, it may not only be there's not a power left. The question may be, what's the substance? We looked at a city this morning in Nanjing. That's a city, could be an instant city, which has, I think, I could argue, substantive content. It has a strategy, it has meaning, it has a hierarchy, it values certain things in certain ways, other things in other ways. I don't know why it's intrinsically impossible to do that.
Well,
why couldn't we do that?
I think there's not much evidence that we have that capacity. We have a capacity of lots of things, above all to commodify everything, including commodifying architecture, and art for that matter. The drive to commodify everything is the essence of this pure capitalism. That's it. Everything is about commodification. We don't like to face these things, but that's the reality. It is.
I think that is true. I think I mean I said at the beginning, and I think it's important, at least for students, to know that what seems to happen in all of these discussions is that Ken's arguments return to what he considers to be a political position, a social position, and an ethical position, so that he's operating and going forward, which you don't find very much anywhere. You certainly don't find it here. Now, whether there's a correlation, a legitimate correlation between a building typology like this and a different building typology, try the Friedrichstrasse, for instance, same architect, whether one is meritorious in an ethical way and one is less so because of its inefficiencies or its largesse or its excess. So I think this is an issue that you raised for us. I wanted to ask you one more thing about the idea of revolution or of a radical position in architecture, and that if you looked at the discussion in architecture in the late teens or 20s of the last century, when what we now see as a choice, modernism as a choice or a stylistic choice, had a real adversary. It had a tiny voice. It was a minority of opinion. And it faced a kind of, I don't know what, McKim, Mead and White, neo, whatever it is, Beaux-Arts, neo. It faced that. And it had a kind of energy and righteousness in a way as it faced a very substantial adversary and was itself a tiny but vigorous voice. And out of that came a certain form language, whether it's tectonics and so on, which we recognize. Now, if you go to the market in West LA, Gelson's, you guys don't have Gelson's, but if you go to Gelson's and on the stand when you check out of the market, there's a magazine, it's called Dwell.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's a piece of junk. And so there's a magazine called Dwell, and in Dwell magazine, what you see, you could argue, at least in a superficial way, in a literal way, is now the form language that again, the style guys and the constructivists and the physicists, all of your friends, once had to fight tooth and nail for. And the question is, how is the argument for revolution and a minority voice at a certain point historically become one of a number of choices stylistically and lost very much its potency and its idiosyncrasy, and it's become something which it won in a way, in a certain way, in a stylistic. It won the battle. The battle's over. Why don't we find another battle?
Yeah.
Can we find another battle? Or are we still fighting a battle that you already won?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes. Well, look, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think the statistic used to be, I don't know whether it still is, that 90% of the built production in the United States has no architect involved in it at all. And the building industry, the home building industry, and those exquisite, well, it's unfair maybe to use the word exquisite, but those actually rather high-quality pieces that appear in Dwell, you know, it obviously is, you know, middle class, upper middle class professionals hiring architects to do quite modest and often very attractive houses, etc. And you can look at that stuff, I think, legitimately and think that, you know, it's very interesting, it seems to me, you know, the way LA is so rich with small one-off modern pieces, how New York and the whole East Coast is rather bare, really. That's the point that Hamilton Howell Harris made a long time ago, actually. And so you can see the work of Dwell today as being yet a further extension of Case Study House, of this very optimistic, upwardly mobile, middle class, upper middle class, middle class. And someone leaving this place and opening up his own office, etc., probably works for that class, doing houses of a similar genre, right? And why not? It's a way of living. It's not an unpleasant way of living. And moreover, I think it is an intervention, a contribution at the level that this profession can still make.
Well, you're very generous. I mean, you're extremely generous because there's another way to look at that, which is that it's extremely cynical that the edge of the discussion, which once belonged to Lissitzky and his pals, doesn't belong to this contemporary. So what it's become is it's become an easy, not difficult, because I think this is also an issue that if you know how to do it and you've memorized the rules, and some do it more artfully than others, no question about it. In fact, the old argument that Richard Meyer did Le Corbusier better than Le Corbusier.
Which I don't believe, but anyway.
But it's not the first time you heard it.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter was that if you wanted to take that line, because Le Corbusier didn't know how to do Le Corbusier, and he was learning, and in the process of learning, it's sometimes a little bit clumsy, sometimes a little bit awkward, sometimes a little bit uncertain, but by the time now it's codified and there's a rule system for it, it makes it more teachable, learnable, transferable, and that's when it starts to get weak.
Yeah, but I think you have to put it into some kind of historical context because, recently actually, Reinhold Martin and we were having some kind of discussion actually, like this, over this book by Vishen Chabarati, and then Reinhold started to say something about revolution, and I got very hot about that, saying, "What are you talking about, revolution? It's ridiculous. There is not going to be a revolution,
Well, tell that to Hannes Meyer.
No, but Hannes Meyer is long since dead.
That's right, but his language is showing up in Dwell.
Yeah, but it's a weak. I know, but you're right about the fact that it's not really his language. It could be, other people. It could also be Howell Hamilton Harris and Neutra and God knows, softer figures than Meyer. But that's not going to happen. Revolution. And if it does happen, the violence will be unbelievable,
Well,
unbelievable.
you've just given us two very different possibilities.
If it does happen, first of all, the level of poverty in this society will become, unbearable before anything could happen. And then it would probably be revolt, and it would be put down with the most ruthless violence, believe you me. It wouldn't hesitate for a second, So, revolution. I just think, that's gone. It's gone. I'm sorry it's gone. The project, in that sense, of course, is what I talked about, the modern project. Between the end of the First World War and the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Civil War was the end of it, basically. Because after the Second World War, it could not really be recovered, the modern project. With some exceptions. Finland was an incredible exception, But because it's a small, rich nation, I think in many respects, the Scandinavians, these small, rich nations in the north, probably have achieved a democracy which we never have had, and certainly not the British haven't had either. This combination of an incredibly rich society with rather well-distributed wealth, and social welfare, of course, so welfare states. But once you lose it, it's very hard to recover it.
I'm not saying it ought to be recovered. I'm saying it's interesting what you say. It's not that there'll be a revolution.
No.
It's
okay.
that, wait, hang on. It's not, or that there ever would have been a revolution.
Well, there was one, of course, but yes.
But that there were those who believed that the conveyor belt to it ran through contemporary architecture. It's not that it was so, it's that its advocates believed it was so. And because they believed it was so, until the palace of the Soviets and other that's right, came along. And once that conviction went away, what I said to begin with is I thought that what is so interesting about your case is the Frampton case is that, well, you're a case, maybe.
Yeah, no, I am. First to admit it.
Well, that's an asset. That's not a liability. That the belief, that the conviction didn't go away. That's the difference between what you're writing and what Dwell is writing. But what I'm saying is, for as a general admonition, it's hard to believe that the revolution is coming on the backs of Hitchcock and Johnson's form language anymore. So it makes it a little bit vacuous.
Yes,
I think.
Right. It's not the place to start, but
Nope.
I mean, the critical regionalism is not exactly, Dwell magazine. It's not. I don't point to the houses.
No, I'm saying one is antithetical to the other.
Yeah, but yeah.
But sometimes things that are very different, strangely enough,
yes.
you know what I'm going to say,
Yes.
look very similar.
Yes, or in carrying one point to a certain limit, it turns into its opposite or something. I mean, that is also. Well, you feel that, I think, if you're a good architect, that, you can sometimes get to a point where the question arises, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why am I creating such an incredible convolution for what? So it's
Well, your friend Yeats wrote that poem about how the center doesn't hold.
Yeah, right. Sure.
And
right.
if architecture connects with poetry and poetry connects with architecture, that may be the answer to the question. Guess what I just built? The center doesn't hold.
Yeah, right.
As opposed to the center's rational.
Right.
Two different
Yes.
ways to see it,
Yes.
maybe. I want to thank you, by the way. Do you want to say something?
No.
Just
said
for
too much already.
showing up.
Yeah.
But does anybody like to interrogate
Yes,
Ken
interrogate is a
Frampton?
good word. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's missing in the conversation 100 years on is the subject of power. And, before, when you cite Mies, they made the greatest work of corporations in the Catholic Church. So, there's a lot of sort of falsehood in the avant-garde about who we work for and, who sponsors innovation. I think that's a missing component in a discussion, and that is politics of the architect, revolutionary or not, the professionals that work. And so to CCTV, I mean, you can fault the architect, but I think that something that has to contextualize the work is the culture that it's made in, and also the sponsor of that work.
That's right. But it's legitimate to criticize both at once, I think. I mean, it's very fitting that building was programmed for 10,000 people to do 250 channels of television a day to be sent out to nearly 2 billion people, 1.5 billion people or whatever, I mean, and then your question raises another issue, because one can see, and I was talking about it at lunch today, where you see on a much more quite different work, you go to the work and you realize that that a mistake was made, and the mistake was double. You could say it was the mistake of the architect. But also you can see how the mistake was the mistake of the client. And one can see, one is witness to I mean, I think that good work comes out of a discourse between the client and the architect. I think if the client doesn't want anything, obviously, if the client has no desire, it's already hopeless. But at the same time, you can see. Well, actually, I don't mind saying it, although it will probably get me into trouble. But the Barnes collection, for example, by Todd Williams, Billy Sin, has a very strange entrance. If you thought that the brief of the building was to have a very large number of visitors coming to this building and being received by the building in an efficient way, so it would not cause a kind of total congestion. And yet, in my opinion, though I've not seen it admittedly in action of late, but the accommodation for receiving these visitors is very, very limited, in my opinion. And then you're really left with a question. It's the architect, right? But also you'd have to say it's the client as well. And I happened to meet the client, very smart Englishman who was at some point or other the creator of the Sainsbury's. It's not as though he wasn't experienced. Or he can't read the drawings. I mean, I don't buy all this, And I think sometimes so from the point of view of who is responsible for the work, it's the architect up to a certain point, but it's also the client. You're right. You pointed that out right now.
But let's go back. Let's go back to the point just before you go to question number 2, that the culture did it, and the client did it.
Yes.
Okay, and one of the tenets you could argue of early modern architecture was very much an adversarial position. Now, granted, somebody thought that the Soviet Union might be the engine for building the kinds of buildings for a constituency that had never had buildings and never had any of those things. Didn't turn out that way. But the idea of resisting what for you is conceptually not acceptable, in other words, and this gets us all into very deep something, because when you're building for a government that does Tiananmen Square, or you're building for a government that has 250 stations and probably 249 of them could be replaced. So the question is, and this used to come up, speaking of Mandela, it used to come up, I remember years ago, a question of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill doing the building in Johannesburg when apartheid was still going on. So if you go back to Ken's, and I'm speaking for him, which is probably not the way to do this, but his premise, which is an ethical premise and a value premise, which associates a certain kind of building type with certain kind of values, whether that's true or not, it wouldn't necessarily obviate the value-related argument. If you don't like the culture and you don't like the client, then you do have an option. Teach the client what the culture ought to be. Teach the client what the culture ought to be. That's conceivable. That aspiration is also part of what used to be considered contemporary architecture. In other words, it's not so much what they gave us, it's what we gave back to them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's why sometimes you're not the right architect for the project, even though it seems like you are. So I think you also have some obligation not just to genuflect when Xi Jinping walks in a room. It's up to you.
Sure, but I think my point only was that, if you consider IBM and the Catholic Church as radical clients, they're not, but what's enduring is the architecture. How long will IBM last, how long will the Catholic Church last? But what Mies importantly is an enduring piece of architecture. So, I don't know to what extent it's the role of the architect to question the politics of
So you have to decide that.
the client.
I mean, I don't think there's a
But
generic...
it's not just the politics of the client. It's the issue of the client not really realizing what the building is, I mean, like in the Barnes collection, I mean, I'm talking about a very intelligent client. I'm left with a question. I mean, maybe I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to the question. But I'm left asking myself the question, why did the client agree to this? Because it's like he couldn't realize that this isn't enough space for the function of the museum. How come he run the museum? He's a man of 50. He's had a lot of experience in running museums. How come he couldn't realize this isn't big enough? Of course, I'm making this judgment. You can, maybe I'm completely wrong, that it's all sweet. I don't know. In my opinion, it's not. I mean, if you're really going to maximize the museum, and presumably, given the world we live in, the number of visitors counts, you don't want to, all that. And so why do we have this? It's not just the architect, is what I'm saying.
Go.
I mean, thinking about the Barnes collection, given the strange circumstances that brought that building, it's a collection that was never supposed to be widely accessible to a broad general public. And I think that there's a way to look at that project, whatever you think of it, as not so much having a bad entry, but rather having a critical entry that seems to be saying something about what is the legacy of the difficulty of accessing the Barnes collection after it has been transformed. And so I don't think that that's using critical regionalism along the lines
This is the
that
relativity of everything.
but it seems to me that there is a kind of,
yes.
there are always other interpretations, and that
Well, the liberal view is there's always other interpretations of everything. But, you know, it's just a common sense thing. I mean, you can't, you're trying to tell me that the very clever architects had such misgivings about this, that they, made a peculiar entrance. I mean, or the client, I mean, it doesn't make sense. It has many other exhibition spaces besides the precious treasure house, And an enormous use of space, by the way. There's enormous, well, you've probably been there, but this vast hall, but, that's something else that drives me nuts. And then you have little tiny cafe, there's something, I mean, I hate to say this, I should shut up because I'm going to have to pay for it. But I mean,
You won't.
I think they already know my reservations in any case. But what the hell they could care. And in any case,
Look,
it's tragic.
I think the point is that he wants to hold you to criteria which says any old criteria, however dexterously argued in retrospect, as you just did, doesn't work for him. Forget about it.
You're talking about me?
No, you don't,
Okay.
you don't, you
Yes,
don't.
yes.
I don't think you'll have to defend. I don't think you'll have to defend calling out the perversities of the Barnes collection in Los Angeles ever. However, I do want to hold you to account a little bit for your stance on LA architecture. I'm wondering if in this trip to Los Angeles you've seen some contemporary work in this city that perhaps challenges some of your earlier verdicts on maybe LA architecture since Gary. I'm curious in particular about in the 90s you often, I won't say often, you at least once and importantly talked about LA architecture as a building cum sculpture and problematic as a result of that. And I think this probably
right.
relates to the bird's nest and the CCTV as well.
Yeah, right.
But I'd like to know if there's something recent here that interests you and calls into question some of that distinction. I'd also like to ask you how you feel about the LA architecture in New York, because it occurs to me that the most provocative reassessments of glazing and verticality in New York in the last decade or two have come from here. It would be Gary's IAC building in Chelsea, Neil Denari's building nearby. I point them out in part because I think there are clear questions of tectonics that drive those projects at one level or another, that emerged from a series of inquiries going on here that didn't seem to meet the criteria you were setting for the question 10 years ago.
Don't know how to answer, really, to be honest.
You don't have to answer.
No, I mean,
No comment.
Yeah, it's something like that. I mean,
Pardon how far I went with that, but could I stick with my first question? Is there anything recent here?
I mean, this is a
Don't worry about it.
the rich city. The modern architectural tradition in this city is rather rich and extensive, and mostly at the level of private houses, I would say, which is what the East Coast can't even begin to equal. I think the more interesting work is in the end, the work, the private houses, actually. I think.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you very much for coming. Thanks very much to Ken for subjecting himself to all of this, and appreciate his insights and his energy, and look forward to seeing him again soon. Thank you very much.